market in such an environment are going to correct a market failure rather than bring about an undue administrative and financial burden on the service providers. So I mentioned that we don't have the luxury of guesswork, so what mechanisms, what tools then can we use to determine the level of competition in the market? Now, the example I have for you is not exhaustive. I know there are several others out there, but there is this thing called the 3 criteria test, which I think has been proven to be rather effective. And for those who are embarking on this journey for the first time, it's one that's relatively easy to understand and implement. So what are these 3 criteria? Could I have the next slide, please? Well, as you can see, these criteria are in that step formation. But what is important is that you have to apply them all at once. You have to apply them together. You don't apply one and neglect the other 2, or you don't apply 2 and neglect 1. These conditions have to exist together in order for you to make a good conclusion. So the first one, criteria 1, are there strong permanent barriers to market entry? So you're looking at your postal market, and then you're trying to answer this question. What kind of barriers are there to market entry? And some of these barriers, you may actually rely on the market itself, interact with the market, and actually ask those operators who were in black in my illustration, interact with them and find out, okay, so why are you guys shying away from this market? Why aren't you coming forward to apply for a license? And they'll give you reasons. They will say, no, the license is too high, the price is too high, your obligations are too onerous, we think that market is already too congested, the dominant firms there are pushing us out. They'll give you all these reasons. It's up to you to make that determination whether those barriers are strong enough and whether on their own, without your intervention, they cannot be taken away. The second criteria is, will competition result in desirable outcomes within the short to medium term without regulatory intervention? So you have seen that there are these barriers to entry. You have also seen that competition is not necessarily functioning the way you want it to be, but you're asking yourself the question, is it going to stay like this forever? Or what is on the horizon? Does it look like competition could actually build up in this market to sufficient levels that we may not need to intervene in the short to medium term? If you make that determination, it's moving you again closer to a final conclusion. And in this final conclusion, you're going to be asking, to what extent can an ex-post intervention, and by ex-post I mean after the fact. So when something has already happened, then you move in with a corrective action. To what extent can a corrective action, which happens after the fact, to what extent can it be sufficient to address the problems that are arising from unfair competition or dominance in the market? So as a regulator, you're asking yourselves these questions. And if the barriers to entry, for instance, are high, rather if the barriers to entry are not long-lasting, and you think that there is recent evidence of increasing competition in that market, you also see that competition is likely to increase in the medium to short term. And also, if you have a good reason to believe that if you intervene after the fact, the market would actually respond, then there is a good reason for you as a regulator to actually refrain from heavy-handed competition regulation. Alternatively, if those conditions exist, what you may choose to do is what I mentioned in the first instance, which is to take on perhaps a more observatory role. You now start monitoring, you keep your pulse, you keep your hand on the pulse of the market. And how do you do that? Remember yesterday we were talking about the ability of the regulator to collect information, analyze information, There is no substitute for that. You have to keep your finger on the pulse of the market and then make that determination. So this criteria is something which personally I would recommend. I know in the management of the postal market, the application of such tools is something which is only now gaining traction. But let us have a scientific approach to determining when and how to intervene in terms of competition in the postal market. And this is just one method to do that. May I have the next slide, please? The next slide. Okay. So here are some other considerations. Remember, I promised to give you a linkage between those policy objectives, the primary legislation, which is your Postal Act, secondary legislation, and in some cases, I'll delve into some license conditions as well. So these are some of the tools that are readily available for regulators to manage competition and the markets simultaneously. So first of all, in your primary law, you should ask yourself the question, what should be there? Those of you who remember the lecture stroke discussion from yesterday, I again went to great lengths to mention that the law itself should be reserved for those stable legal principles, those that are not likely to change over time, those that are onerous to change. There's no incentive to change them today, tomorrow, and so on. But they are legal principles of law that you need to put in the law, and that is where primary legislation comes in. So some of the things you should have in your act, if you don't have this, is the legal mandate for the regulator to carry out market analysis and to monitor competition levels, and to also determine dominance. You would be surprised that in some jurisdictions, the regulator has got no legal mandate to determine dominance. But if you are going to manage the market effectively, you need that legal mandate, you need that legal right to do so. Otherwise, all these tools, all this criteria we were talking about, you won't be able to use it. So that legal right should be in the law. Also, the power to intervene when there is anti-competitive behavior. What use is a law which only allows you to monitor and not to act when something is wrong? That is a useless law. Your law should specifically say, yes, our regulator has the mandate to monitor competition, but they also have the mandate to intervene when they determine that competition is not working the way it should. And I think there's an important point at the end there. There's the beginning of collaborative regulation in there as well, if you can see that. This legal mandate to intervene could be for the sector regulator alone or in collaboration with a general competition authority. I know in some jurisdictions you do have consumer protection and competition authorities. For a fact, I know Zambia has one. I don't know, just by a quick show of hands, which other countries have similar organizations? Yes, Angola, Malawi. And over there, that is it the Gambia? Yes, yes. So the law should provide for that collaboration. It should recognize that in some cases, the postal regulator would need to interact with the competition authority in order to come up with the appropriate determination and the appropriate action. The law may also specify the general types of remedies and the penalties which are available for anti-competitive behavior. Excuse me. Why I'm saying general, again, is because it needs to be broad enough to accommodate whatever new inventions as regulators you may come up with to manage competition. We can't be so specific there. We have to be broad and general enough and forward-looking enough to recognize that some changes may come in the future, and this law should allow us to deal with them through the secondary legislation, which is more flexible. And in the secondary legislation, some of the things we're looking for is actually allowing the regulator that ability to exercise, ex ante measures. Ex ante is the opposite of ex post. Ex ante means you are anticipating that something could go wrong, and so you take measures beforehand. Rather than ex post, where you wait for the something to go wrong and then you take corrective measures. So your secondary legislation should allow you, if we are following this story, you already have the legal mandate to monitor your market, so you probably have an economic regulation department that is, analyzing this information. But when they come up with that information and it's pointing to a certain direction, they shouldn't wait for that downfall to occur. They should be in a position to say, look, the way we are analyzing things, the way this market is heading, we are seeing a problem in the near future. Can we do something now to prevent that disaster from happening? The secondary legislation should empower the regulator to do such. Also, I think what is important is this secondary legislation should promote certain principles. First of all, effectiveness. Effectiveness, what I mean in this context is that it should be designed to control a specific problem without unnecessarily creating a regulatory burden on the licensed entities. So, as it says there on the slide, the principle itself is that it should be designed to solve identified problems efficiently and avoid unnecessary regulatory burdens for operators. And it should allow the NRA to also control the possible abuse of dominance by operators, and also to encourage smaller firms to enter the market. All these things should be allowed through the secondary legislation. Proportionality is another important principle. How heavy-handed should your intervention be? This principle goes like this. Let the punishment fit the crime. Let us not go with a shotgun to kill a mosquito. If the problem is small, the intervention should be equally small. If the problem is big, that's when you consider a heavy-handed approach. But this idea of proportionality should be ingrained in us as regulators as we do our work on a day-to-day basis. You have to have that determination of how severe is this behavior and how severe should our intervention be in return. Through the license, you are also empowered as regulators to introduce certain measures. First of all, transparency obligations. So you can compel every licensee to publish certain information, to publicize rather certain information. It could be maybe audited financial accounts or technical specifications or prices or network elements. But you are simply saying, in order for this market to be fully competitive, we want the general public to be fully aware, fully informed of what is behind the scenes. And the consumers will then be able to utilize this information to make appropriate choices. And those choices will enhance the competitiveness of that market. Also, the principle of non-discrimination. So what you're doing here is, for instance, if you look at my illustration of the three big firms who are in collusion with each other, 9 times out of 10, what those firms will be doing is saying, let us keep all the volume between us three. Let us not allow any of these other guys to take a market share. If any of these other guys comes to us to say, look, I want to have a collaboration agreement with you. Let us interconnect. I've seen you have a big infrastructure to go to that far province. Can I, give you some of my packages? What that firm is going to do is either charge a very high price for such interconnection or simply refuse it altogether. But if they are obliged through a license condition to be non-discriminatory in their conduct, then they will be obliged to offer a similar interconnection agreement to any other market player that comes along. So that is what you're able to achieve through that license condition. There's also an access obligation that you can use. Okay, I think this is similar to the one that I've just mentioned. And finally, the cost-based pricing obligation. This one, as you will see when we talk about tariff regulation, is not the easiest thing to implement. But what we have found from experience is that some of the obligations, when you do give them to the operators, they are actually the ones who come up with creative ways of fulfilling those obligations. What you run with as a regulator is a principle which you have to uphold, you want to uphold, and the mechanism for upholding that principle, sometimes you leave it to the operator themselves. So you're going to say, to give them an obligation to say, for instance, yes, you are free to set your prices in this market, but when we come to you and ask you how you came up with that price, you better have a reasonable explanation of how you did that. We are not expecting you to have a non-scientific way of determining your price, to just pluck a figure out of the air and say, I will charge 100,000 from Senegal to Ghana. What is the basis? Please, understand me correctly. Your argument is not necessarily on the price itself, but what you're arguing is the price should have a logical way of being determined. And cost accounting principles are one such logical way that we can use. So you're going to ask the operator, how did you come up with this 100,000? And they'll tell you, no, from this location, I have so much staff there. I need to use a vehicle to ferry this to that location. Then there is this agreement that I have with another carrier, and it costs me so much. And then on top of all these costs, I need to make a reasonable profit. And you will be able to see this breakdown. And the economists will tell you, remember you have that economics regulation department, they will tell you, yes, this looks reasonable. Let's allow it. But where you see fluctuations in the market that are unsupported by any logic, as a regulator, you should have the legal mandate to intervene and correct such behavior. And one of the ways you can do that is by imposing cost-based pricing obligations. Okay, let's move to the next slide. So let's have some conclusions regarding competition and market management. The first one is that the underlying theory is that from what we learned yesterday, the USO can still be satisfied in a manner that is compatible with the promotion of effective competition in markets for profit-making activities. What am I saying here? The onus is on us as regulators to create an environment where our DPO is functioning effectively, they are delivering the USO, they are also active in a competitive side of the market, also making profits there, along with all the private entities that are in that competitive side of the market. Both of those objectives should be realized if we are doing our work right. We should have an environment where the USO can still function, either through support. Like we said yesterday, there are those, the USO funding and the subsidies and so on. We should have a market which allows that side of the market to still go on while there is effective competition on the competitive side. Secondary legislation should lay down procedures to ensure that access to the market is subject to objective, transparent, and non-discriminatory procedures. I think I dwelt a bit on that, on describing that illustration of where we had those operators in black wanting to enter into either of those two markets. As a regulator, the onus is on us to create an environment where that access is clear and the procedures are clear and known to everyone and they are transparent and they do not discriminate. Also, the idea underpinning free market entry needs to exist, and effective competition needs to deliver better services for consumers. Otherwise, what is the purpose of competition if the outcome is not consumer satisfaction at the end of the day? Another conclusion is that the key issue for postal markets is the level of maturity and the possibility of collusion or market dominance among a few firms. Let me emphasize this point of market maturity. Some theorists will argue that when there's competition, you shouldn't intervene as a regulator. Even in that illustration I had of evenly matched firms, each one with, a reasonable market share, the argument is actually based on that scenario, and people will say, you shouldn't intervene. But there is a disclaimer to that whole scenario, and that is, if the market is not mature, and what do I mean by that? If the market you are talking about is a market which has only 1 or 2 firms, 2 or 3 firms, in a population that is so large, the market forces that you could be seeing could actually be artificially induced. And you could draw the wrong conclusions based on that interaction. So you should be in a position to say, yes, this market is now mature enough. There are many operators, and when we see their interaction, it actually does result in some of those desirable outcomes. If that process is not working, then the theory of the market being able to control dominance would not hold water. Finally, the existence and the mandate of national competition authorities also needs to be relied upon. It also needs to be taken into consideration and is the basis for collaborative regulation when it comes to competition. So I believe this is, can I say, a rather compressed story regarding postal market competition management. I have introduced quite a number of things there, but I hope there is clarity in what I've said, and also that there are some building blocks for us to consider regard. Please. Closely related to competition is interconnection and network access. The next slide, please. So for this particular topic, what I want us to realize is that in a market which has multiple operators, from the policy perspective, you should already have that expectation that these operators should be free to collaborate as they see fit. As long as their collaboration is something which is, based on mutually beneficial terms. Also, that collaboration is not harmful then to other players in the market. Remember, collaboration could actually be the other side of collusion. Okay? Those 3 firms that we saw in our illustration could actually argue to say, no. You have allowed collaboration and this is what we are doing. But when your collaboration is not transparent, it's not proportional, and it's not non-discriminatory, it becomes something else. So from a matter of principle, this is what you are after. You have to recognize that this is a multi-operator environment, and the operators should be free to collaborate with each other to make money. Now, given that context, what should your postal law say? What should your primary legislation say? Well, what I recommend is that this law should give the regulator an appropriate level of regulatory oversight over some of those elements, such as providing the guiding principles for interconnection. As a regulator, you should be empowered to say, look, if you are going to interconnect in this market, these are the principles we want you to observe. Be non-discriminatory, be transparent. Okay, that's not too heavy-handed. All you are asking them is to observe the principles. You should also be able to perhaps describe some conditions for access to the DPO's network. That is a critical national infrastructure. It's a special infrastructure. Yes, there is interconnection which can be encouraged and probably not encouraged, but on the commercial basis alone, you may not make a good conclusion. And there are other considerations that you need to have. The universal service objective, for instance. So as a regulator, you should be in a position to say, for any private entity to interconnect with the DPO, here are some things for them to take into consideration. They should be, for instance, mindful of the fact that this is public infrastructure with a USO already inherent in their license. And as such, we may oblige you to say, if you are interconnecting to deliver to that far-flung area, can you also, on your way there, carry some of this USO mandate as part of that collaboration agreement? So this is just an example of some of the conditions that you could set. There could be others. Also, the rules for negotiated commercial agreements, including the pricing. So again, this is linked to the first one about giving principles. As a regulator, you could say, here, if you are going to interconnect, your pricing should be fair and non-discriminatory. Okay? You shouldn't be in a position as an operator to charge this one, this amount, and then charge for the same exact service, you charge another operator 10 times more. What's the basis for doing that? What's the basis? So as a regulator, you should be in a position to, at least provide such guidance to the operators. Also, another important one, dispute resolution. When those collaborating operators argue, they disagree, what recourse do they have? Who can they go to? They're operating in your sector. You have regulatory oversight. They should be free to come to you and say, look, we have this disagreement. This guy is saying this guy is saying that, but this is our position. And as a regulator, you should be in a position to say, okay, based on the rules and the principles that we have given, this one is wrong and this one is right, and we recommend this remedy. In some cases, operators will have nowhere else to go, and they will rely on you to resolve such disputes. Another interesting one is the regulation of extraterritorial offices of exchange, ETOs. This topic, I think a few years back, was rather high on the agenda at UPU level, and as jurisdictions we were grappling with what exactly do we do with these things? What are they even? But in the absence of a legal provision in your law, your hands are tied. Your hands are tied. You may not have any recourse to correct anything harmful that is coming out of such collaboration. So as a regulator, you should be arguing for at least some legal mandate to have oversight on the conduct of ETOs in your jurisdictions. And this oversight may be, for instance, they need to get permission from you to set up an ETO in your jurisdiction. And that permission, I think, should be supported by some reasonable evaluation on your part as to whether there's benefit or harm to your postal market, especially to your DPO. But in the absence of a legal provision, they will sneak in and do whatever they like, and you will have no recourse to protect your DPO. On the secondary legislation side, I think this one is relatively simple. All you will be seeking to do is all these principles under the primary legislation, you will seek to operationalize them through more flexible, more detailed instruments to allow you to do your job. Okay? That is as far as my story goes for interconnection and network access for now. Again, this is meant to stimulate your thought and also further discussion on how we can evolve this area of postal regulation. Let's move to the next slide, please. To conclude, some principles on interconnection, just to emphasize what you can do when you're looking at the pricing. Remember, I mentioned that as a regulator, you're interested in how the operators are setting up their interconnection pricing. Some of the things you can look at is how have they bundled or unbundled their services and priced them accordingly. Are they looking at collection separately? Because collection is something which an operator could actually offer to another operator as a commercial service. They can say, look, you don't have a physical presence in this location, but I do. I can use my counter to accept your mail, and I'll charge you X amount. That is a reasonable, collaboration agreement that could be set up right there. What about outward sorting? So you have collected your mail, but you don't have the facilities to sort for outward mail, for outward transmission. But your competitor has that facility. You bring that mail and you say, look, this is the mail which I've collected. I want it to go to this, to this destination. You have the facilities. How much are you going to charge me? That is a form of interconnection. What about transportation? I think that one is relatively easy to understand. You don't have the transportation network. You have the ability to sort, you have sorted it, you have bundled it nicely, but you simply don't have the vehicle to move. But your competitor has that vehicle. You can go to them and say, look, can I, take a compartment in your vehicle for my mail? And they'll ask you how much are you going to charge me? So that is another segment of interconnection. What about delivery? Also very easy to understand. So you have this whole chain. You're able to collect, you're able to sort, you're able to transport, but you don't have any means to deliver at the final destination. Perhaps the mail that you're transporting is more appropriate to be delivered, for instance, through a PO box. The PO box belongs to the DPO. You should be in a position to interact with your DPO and say, look, DPO, here's some money for you. I have this mail. The final delivery point is through your network, through your infrastructure. Can we come to an agreement? It's win-win. Delivery could also entail the actual delivery persons. In those countries with well-developed addressing systems, you still have a guy on a motorbike going door to door to deliver. That is another service which you can offer your competitor at a price. So whenever we are thinking about interconnection and network access, let us have this picture. This is the picture I'm talking about when it comes to the postal context. Access to the incumbents network, I think I've dwelt a bit on that already. The principle that should be upheld is that this should be voluntary and not mandatory in our jurisdictions. As I said, you should be in a position to make a determination whether there is actually mutual benefit in what is happening. You shouldn't be compelling the DPO to say, you must interconnect with everyone. There should always be an evaluation of the benefit. And if, as I've said, from the examples that I've given you here, you actually determine that, yes, the DPO can benefit from transporting mail for others. The DPO can benefit from delivering on behalf of others. They can actually generate some revenue. Then you allow it. Okay? So I think that's the final point. May I have the next slide, please? Yes, I hope that makes sense. I hope this topic is, really resonating with all of you here today. Are we okay? Perfect, perfect. Let's talk about research and market surveillance. This is another important regulatory function which I believe my colleague covered yesterday, but let's look at the nitty-gritty. Let's have the next slide, please. The next slide? Yes. So I think the key point I want to emphasize in this particular topic is that gone are the days where as a regulator, you had the luxury of guesswork. Your stakeholders do not expect you to guess. If you are going to guess, it should be an educated guess. Regulators should make decisions which are evidence-based to the furthest extent possible. Okay, to the furthest extent possible is just a realization that there are limits to what we can know at any given time. But the point is, you should always make an effort as a regulator to base your decision on some evidence. How do you generate such evidence? It's through research and market surveillance. Information has to be obtained. And when this information is obtained, it could have multiple uses. For information that is being obtained, as I mentioned, is to determine the level of competition in the market. Also, to determine the level of uptake of goods and services. You could be saying this market is functioning well, it is an effectively functioning market, but consumers are not using those services. A case in point is, and I know this is not really such a perfect example, but this is one which would resonate with some of us, because postal facilities have been used in the past to introduce what are called community information centers. Okay, so you are rolling out public access to internet through the post office. And you have satisfied, you have convinced yourself that this is a good thing. But when you go to that location where that facility is, you find that none of the local people are using it. None of them. Why? Maybe because the content that is there is not relevant to them. You have taken access, for instance, to market information on farming to a fishing community. What are they going to do with it? Maybe you have taken public access to the education, to higher education and so on, in a community where everyone is above that, school-going age. Maybe you have taken public access in a community that is traders. Their main interest is trading, and what you have taken there is content that is related to agriculture. So there is this mismatch. Similarly, if we bring it to the postal context, you could be advocating, you're really forcing operators to introduce, let's say, a parcel service in a particular location, when actually what they are really crying for is a postal financial service. And you will not know if you are not carrying out your surveillance. You will not know that the uptake of these services is really low. So that's one reason, very compelling reason. Also, you can collect that information to utilize for advocacy purposes. And for advocacy, I mean, how do you sell the sector to investors? How do you sell the sector to, cooperating partners? I know we are talking about USO, the investment in infrastructure. If as a country you have determined that the World Bank or IMF should come in to assist you to build that infrastructure, what are you going to convince them with? What is the information that you're going to put on the table to depict the potential of this sector that you're selling? You have to gather and analyze and package that information as regulators. There's no one else to do it. It's in your best interest to do so. So some of the indicators that you should be interested in are things such as consumer uptake and usage, as I mentioned. Consumer satisfaction. Are you measuring that? How happy are you with the postal and courier services in this location? When was the last time you did that? Remember, those are one of your key stakeholders, so how are you protecting their interests if you're not interacting with them? You have to ask them, when was the last time you did a consumer survey as a regulator? How many of you know how satisfied or dissatisfied your consumers actually are? Yes, someone did mention technology yesterday, and I fully agree with them. Some of the tools you could be using to gather this information are actually digital, easy to deploy. You could actually leverage the mobile phone, like I said, carry out a survey on that. You know, people just click, answer 3 questions, click, 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 and you have your data. But how many of us are doing that?